The first time a sheriff and Oppo's deputy told me to get off my own lake, I honestly thought he was joking. I was sitting in a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat, drifting across water that legally belonged to me, holding a fishing rod in one hand and a cold root beer in the other, when I looked up and saw flashing lights bouncing across the shoreline. At first I figured somebody had a flat tire on the county road. Then I saw who was standing beside the patrol car, and my stomach sank. Vanessa Crow, president of the Copper Ridge Shores HOA. Arms folded, chin lifted, staring at me like she and Oppo's just caught a criminal in the middle of a getaway. The deputy stepped down to the water and Oppo's edge and called out, and quote, "Sir, we received a complaint that you and Oppo's trespassing," and quote. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't and Oppo's know how else to react. And quote, "Trespassing?" and quote. I yelled back. And quote, "This is my lake." And quote. The deputy looked uncomfortable immediately, like a man who already suspected he and Oppo's been dragged into somebody else and Oppo's nonsense. But Vanessa wasn't Oppo's backing down. She pointed directly at me and shouted, and quote, "We warned him. He doesn't and Oppo's get special treatment just because he bought property next to us." And quote, bought property next to them. That and Oppo's, that's what she called it. Like I hadn't and Oppo's purchased the entire ranch fair and square. Like the lake was somehow theirs, and I was the outsider. Standing there in that boat, watching her perform for the crowd gathering behind her, I realized something important. This wasn't Oppo's about a lake. It wasn't Oppo's even about property. This was about control. My name is Grant Holloway. I and Oppo's am 54 years old, retired from the energy industry, and after 3 decades of airports, boardrooms, and 70-hour work weeks, I finally spent my savings on the one thing I and Oppo's always wanted, peace. 46 acres outside a small Arizona town called Cedar Bluff. A modest ranch house. A barn that needed more repairs than I care to admit. A loyal old Labrador named Duke. And a spring-fed lake tucked between cottonwood trees that looked like something from a postcard. The previous owner had been an elderly rancher named Walter Briggs. Everybody in town knew him. Walter was one of those old-school guys who never locked a gate and trusted everybody until they gave him a reason not to. For years he and Oppo's allowed nearby residents to fish, swim, paddle canoes, and enjoy the lake whenever they wanted. No paperwork, no contracts, no easements, just neighborly kindness. Then Walter passed away. His daughter inherited the property and eventually sold it to me. Apparently nobody bothered telling the HOA that kindness doesn't and Oppo's transfer with a deed. 3 days after moving in, I walked into the HOA office carrying homemade cookies. Yeah, I know how that sounds. A grown man showing up with cookies. But my grandmother taught me to bake, and she always said good neighbors are worth the effort. Vanessa Crow barely glanced at the cookies. And quote, "I hope you and Oppo's planning to maintain the lake properly," and quote, she said. Not hello, not welcome to the neighborhood, just straight into business. I smiled politely. And quote, "I and Oppo's LL do my best," and quote, she nodded toward the window. And quote, "A lot of families use that lake," and quote, "Well, it and Oppo's a ranch lake," and quote, I replied. And quote, "I mostly plan to fish," and quote, her expression changed instantly. And quote, "Fishing ISN and Oppo's permitted on community property," and quote, I stared at her for a second. And quote, "Ma and Oppo's and the lake belongs to me," and quote. The smile disappeared from her face. Then she leaned back in her chair and said 2 words that would eventually start this entire mess. And quote, "We and Oppo's LLC," and quote. Over the following weeks, strange little things started happening. Private property signs vanished overnight. Teenagers showed up swimming from my dock. A landscaping crew wandered onto my shoreline and started trimming trees without permission. Every time I politely corrected someone, they reacted like I was the problem, like I was somehow stealing something from them. Then one Saturday morning I woke up and found nearly 50 HOA residents hosting a barbecue on my shoreline. Coolers, speakers, folding chairs, children running through my property. Someone had even tied a floating beer cooler to my dock. I walked down and calmly asked them to leave. 20 minutes later Vanessa arrived. She looked furious. And quote, This lake has belonged to this community for years. End quote. End quote. No. End quote. I replied. End quote. People used it for years. That and Oppos. It's not the same thing. End quote. Her eyes narrowed. End quote. You and Oppos, redestroying a tradition. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos am protecting my property. End quote. That conversation changed everything. 2 days later, my boathouse was vandalized. Fishing gear destroyed. Windows broken. Spray paint covering one side of the building. The police took a report, but nobody was caught. So I installed cameras. Then came the morning that started the real war. I launched my boat just before sunrise. Duke sat beside me while I drifted quietly across the water. For the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful. Then I heard shouting from shore. Vanessa was back, phone in hand, recording me, yelling that I was violating HOA rules. 10 minutes later, she called the sheriff. 20 minutes later, the deputy arrived. And less than an hour after that, while Vanessa celebrated what she thought was a victory, I made a phone call that would change everything. Not to a lawyer, not to the sheriff, not to the county. I called a real estate broker. Because while Vanessa was busy trying to throw me off my own lake, I and Oppos just learned something very interesting about the marina her HOA depended on. And by sunset that same day, I was preparing to buy every inch of it. The funny thing about people who are obsessed with control is that they usually spend so much time watching everyone else that they stop paying attention to their own weaknesses. Vanessa Crow spent months monitoring my ranch, documenting my activities, filing complaints, and trying to convince anyone who would listen that I was somehow threatening the community. Meanwhile, she never noticed that I had started quietly digging through property records. The marina sat less than half a mile from the lake. Most residents didn't and Oppos think much about it because it had always been there. Small docks, boat storage, a fuel station, and the only practical place where Copper Ridge Shore's residents could launch larger boats. The marina wasn't and Oppos technically owned by the HOA, but it was so closely connected to the neighborhood that most people assumed it was. What I discovered made me smile for the first time in weeks. The owner, an elderly businessman named Raymond Kessler, was retiring. His children had no interest in running it. The property had been listed quietly for months with almost no serious buyers. By the end of that week, I was sitting across from Raymond in a diner drinking terrible coffee while discussing numbers. End quote. You sure you want this headache? End quote. Raymond asked. End quote. Depends. End quote. I said. End quote. How big is the headache? End quote. He laughed. End quote. Bigger than you think. End quote. 2 weeks later, the marina belonged to me. I didn't and Oppos announce it. I didn't and Oppos throw a celebration. I simply continued living my life while paperwork finalized in the background. Then came the HOA and Oppos' annual Summer on the Water Festival. Hundreds of residents attended every year. Boat races, food vendors, live music, fireworks. Vanessa loved that festival because it gave her a stage, a chance to remind everyone how important she was. 3 days before the event, I mailed a formal notice to the HOA board. The marina would be closed temporarily for safety inspections and infrastructure upgrades. Completely legal, completely reasonable, absolutely devastating. The board meeting that followed became the talk of the entire county. According to one resident who later described it to me, Vanessa nearly threw a binder across the room. Phones rang nonstop. Residents demanded answers. Vendors threatened cancellations. The festival suddenly had no launch point for boats, no parking access, no event infrastructure. Everything revolved around the marina. Everything. 2 days later, Vanessa appeared at my front gate. She didn't and Oppos bother pretending to be friendly this time. End quote. You and Oppos redoing this on purpose. End quote. End quote. Doing what? End quote. I asked. End quote. The marina. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos am improving my property. End quote. Her jaw tightened. End quote. You bought it to hurt this community. End quote. I shrugged. End quote. Funny. That and Oppos. That's exactly what you accused me of doing with my own lake. End quote. For a second I thought she might actually explode. Instead she stepped closer and lowered her voice. End quote. You think this is over? End quote. End quote. No. End quote. I said honestly. End quote. I think it and Oppos just getting started. End quote. What happened next surprised even me. Not because of Vanessa, By then I expected almost anything I'd carefully built over the years. Then a woman named Emily Rhodes knocked on my door. Emily lived in Copper Ridge Shores and taught third grade at the local elementary school. I and Oppos, seen her once or twice, but never really spoken with her. She looked nervous standing on my porch. End quote. I think you should see something. End quote. She handed me a thick folder. Inside were copies of HOA financial records, meeting minutes, internal emails, budget reports. I spent 2 hours reviewing them after she left. By the time I finished, I understood why Vanessa was so desperate to control the lake. It wasn't Oppos, emotional. It wasn't Oppos, tradition. It wasn't Oppos, community spirit. It was money. Years earlier, the HOA had used photographs of the lake in virtually every marketing package promoting Copper Ridge Shores. Real estate agents advertised lake access. Developers referenced recreational opportunities. Property values increased because buyers believed the lake was effectively part of the neighborhood experience. If residents lost access permanently, property values could drop significantly. Vanessa knew that. The board knew that, which meant every fight, every complaint, every act of harassment had been driven by one simple fear. They weren't Oppos, protecting the community. They were protecting property values, and more specifically, their own investments. Suddenly everything made sense. The vandalism, the pressure, the constant attempts to paint me as unreasonable. They needed me to surrender because admitting the truth would cost money. A lot of money. A week later, another incident pushed everything into overdrive. One of my cameras recorded a group of residents cutting through a locked section of fencing near the eastern shoreline. At first, I thought it was teenagers being stupid. Then I recognized one of the adults helping them. It was an HOA board member. The footage spread through town faster than wildfire. People were furious. Some at me, most at the HOA. But the biggest turning point came when county officials finally completed a review of historical land records. During a public meeting attended by nearly 200 residents, the county surveyor presented his findings. Every single inch of the lake belonged to my ranch. There were no easements, no shared ownership agreements, no community access rights. Nothing. The room fell completely silent. Years of assumptions evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Vanessa sat frozen in her chair while residents stared at her. One man stood up and asked the question everyone was thinking. End quote. You knew this? End quote. She didn't. Oppos, answer immediately. That hesitation told people everything they needed to know. The backlash was immediate. Residents demanded explanations. Board members began distancing themselves from Vanessa. Some claimed they had been misled. Others resigned entirely. For the first time since moving to Cedar Bluff, I thought maybe the conflict was finally ending. Then Duke nearly died. I found him lying beside the barn one evening, struggling to breathe. The veterinarian later confirmed someone had thrown poisoned meat onto my property. Thankfully, he survived. Barely. Sitting beside him that night in the emergency clinic changed something inside me. Up until then, I and Oppos treated the whole situation like an absurd neighborhood feud. Annoying, frustrating, sometimes even funny. But watching that old dog fight for his life stripped away any remaining patience I had. Somebody had crossed a line. The next morning, I hired a private investigator named Caleb Mercer, a former detective with a reputation for finding answers people didn't and Oppos, want found. 3 weeks later, Caleb called. End quote. Grant, end quote. He said quietly. End quote. I think we need to talk. End quote. His tone alone made my stomach tighten. End quote. What did you find? End quote. There was a long pause. Then he said 5 words that changed the entire direction of the story. End quote. This was never about the lake. End quote. I stood there staring across the water. End quote. Then what was it about? End quote. Caleb exhaled slowly. End quote. Your ranch sits on top of something worth millions. End quote. Suddenly, every argument, every threat, every act of intimidation looked completely different. Because if Caleb was right, Vanessa Crow hadn't and Oppos been fighting for lake access at all. She and Oppos been trying to get me off the property before I discovered what was buried underneath it. For a long time after that phone call, I just stood there looking across the lake. The water was calm. Duke was asleep on the porch behind me. The sun was dropping behind the cottonwoods. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, It felt like every strange thing that had happened over the previous year had suddenly rearranged itself into a completely different picture. End quote. Millions? End quote. I finally asked. End quote. What exactly are we talking about? End quote. Caleb was quiet for a moment. End quote. Rare earth deposits. End quote. I didn't oppose. Say anything. End quote. Geological surveys were conducted 15 years ago. End quote. He continued. End quote. Nothing ever moved forward because ownership was fragmented back then. But your ranch sits directly over the largest section. End quote. I felt my stomach tighten. Suddenly the vandalism, the legal pressure, the constant harassment, even the attempts to push me into selling at below market value started making sense. Not completely, but enough. Vanessa Crow wasn't oppose. Fighting over fishing rights. She wasn't oppose. Obsessed with preserving community traditions. She was trying to gain control of land that had become far more valuable than anyone in town realized. The next few weeks felt like a slow-motion train wreck. Caleb uncovered emails connecting several HOA board members to a private development group operating through shell companies. The deeper he dug, the uglier things became. Hidden land acquisitions, quiet negotiations, investors purchasing parcels around my ranch through intermediaries. Somebody had been building a position for years. They just needed the final piece. They needed me. The problem was I wasn't oppose. Selling. Not anymore. 2 days later, Caleb and I met with attorney Rebecca Sloan, a former federal prosecutor who had the unsettling habit of smiling whenever someone presented her with evidence of wrongdoing. After reviewing everything, she leaned back in her chair. End quote. This ISN and oppose. A property dispute. End quote. End quote. What is it? End quote. I asked. She tapped the stack of documents. End quote. Potential fraud. Possible conspiracy. Maybe more. End quote. Within a month, subpoenas started flying. County investigators arrived. Financial records were requested. Former board members suddenly became very interested in cooperating. The pressure that Vanessa had spent years applying to everyone else finally turned around and landed directly on her doorstep. Then came the town hall meeting. Nearly every resident of Copper Ridge Shores showed up. Reporters packed the room. Local officials lined the walls. The atmosphere felt less like a community meeting and more like the final scene of a courtroom drama. Vanessa stood at the front, trying desperately to maintain control. For years, she had been the most powerful voice in the neighborhood. But power has a funny way of disappearing once people stop believing in it. One resident stood up, then another, then another. Questions became accusations. Accusations became demands. Financial discrepancies, secret negotiations, missing disclosures, half-truths. Every answer Vanessa gave only made things worse. Finally, an elderly resident named Arthur Briggs slowly rose from his chair. Arthur had lived there longer than almost anyone. People respected him. When he spoke, the room listened. End quote. Did you ever tell us the truth? End quote. He asked quietly. The silence that followed felt enormous. Vanessa looked around the room. No applause. No support. No allies rushing to defend her. Just hundreds of eyes waiting for an answer. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked down. That was the moment everything ended. Not with shouting. Not with dramatic speeches. Just silence. The following weeks brought resignations, investigations, and lawsuits. Several board members stepped down. Others hired attorneys. The development group quietly withdrew from multiple projects. Investors started disappearing faster than they had appeared. Nobody wanted their name attached to the growing scandal. Eventually, Vanessa resigned as HOA president. The announcement arrived through a short email barely 3 sentences long. After years of conflict, years of threats, years of trying to control everyone around her, that was how it ended. No grand farewell. No final victory. Just a resignation letter and an empty office. A few months later, I received a certified envelope. Inside was a settlement proposal from parties connected to the development group. The amount was enough money to change several generations of a family and Oppo's future. Enough to retire 10 times over. Enough to buy almost anything I could ever want. Rebecca looked at the number and raised an eyebrow. End quote. Most people would take this. End quote. End quote. Would you? End quote. I asked. She smiled. End quote. That and Oppos. SYI and Oppos. I'm a lawyer and not a ranch owner. End quote. For 3 days I thought about it. 3 days of walking the shoreline. 3 days of sitting on the dock. 3 days of remembering why I bought the property in the first place. It wasn't Apos, tea about money. It never had been. The answer became surprisingly simple. I declined. Every offer, every conversation, every negotiation. The ranch stayed exactly where it had always been. Mine. 6 months later, something happened that nobody expected. The new HOA leadership reached out. Not with demands. Not with complaints. An apology. A genuine one. They admitted mistakes had been made. They admitted residents had been misled. They asked if there was any way to repair the relationship between the ranch and the community. Honestly, part of me wanted to say no. After everything that happened, that would have been easy. But easy ISN and Apos, T always right. So I made them an offer. One weekend each month, local families could access a designated section of the lake for fishing, kayaking, and community events. No HOA control. No ownership claims. No special privileges. Just neighbors acting like neighbors. The first event drew nearly 200 people. Kids laughed. Families cooked barbecue. Veterans swapped stories. People who hadn't Apos, T spoken to each other in years sat together watching the sunset. At one point I looked across the water and saw something I hadn't Apos, T seen in a very long time. Peace. Real peace. Not because someone won. Not because someone lost. Because people finally stopped fighting. Yet the story didn't end Apos, T completely end there. About 8 months later, Caleb called me one last time. End quote. You sitting down? End quote. He asked. End quote. Should I be? End quote. He laughed softly. End quote. Remember those geological surveys? End quote. End quote. Yeah. End quote. End quote. New studies came back. End quote. I leaned forward. End quote. End quote. End quote. The deposits are worth even more than anyone originally estimated. End quote. I stared across the lake again. Same water. Same dock. Same ranch. Yet somehow the decision felt heavier now than ever before. Because I knew the offers would return. Bigger this time. More persistent. Maybe impossible to ignore. And that and Apos. That's where things stand today. The ranch is still mine. The lake is still mine. The phone still rings every few months with someone wanting to talk business. So here in Apos, that's the question I want to leave with you. If you discovered your land was worth tens of millions of dollars, would you hold on to it no matter what? Or would there eventually be a price that could make you walk away? Let me know down in the comments because people around here still argue about that question all the time. And if you enjoyed this story, Don and Apos, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't in Apos, really about property, money, or power. Sometimes they and Apos, about deciding what matters enough to stand your ground when the entire world wants you to move.